Let go, let flow. A Dharma, teaching on surrender. In a peaceful riverside village, where water flows gently beside endless green rice fields, lived a man named Thomas. He wasn't poor, nor was he extraordinarily wealthy, but slowly, steadily, he had managed to accumulate land, expand his home, and gain influence in the village. People spoke of him in hushed tones, partly admiring, partly wary. Thomas is smart, but he plays the game hard. Thomas had an older brother named David. They had grown up together, sharing sweet potatoes during the leanest years. When their parents passed away, they left behind a riverside property, meant to be divided equally between the two. David, ever the peacemaker, chose the smaller half, saying, "You're younger. You have a family to provide for. Take the larger portion." Thomas remembered those words, and then he forgot them. As time passed, that riverside property became the most valuable land in the village. A new eco-tourism development was rumored to be on the horizon. Thomas began calculating. If he could claim David's half, he'd own the entire stretch. Quietly, without confrontation, he hired someone to redraw the boundary lines. Using old loopholes and forgotten paperwork, he filed a claim saying David had encroached on his land. The villagers murmured, but no one dared oppose him. David, who once carried Thomas through flooded roads to school, who had given up his inheritance, sat silently in his bamboo hut, eyes clouded but gentle. He didn't fight. He only said, "If the land means more to you than our brotherhood, then take it." That one sentence cut through Thomas like a blade. But still, he nodded. The lawyers did the rest. He won the case. He now owned all the riverside land. A victor, a success story. Villagers kept their distance. Some avoided his gaze when walking by, but Thomas didn't care. In his mind, there was only one truth. He must be in control. Dharma, karma, compassion. Just old stories for the naive, he thought. Life is about strategy, he often said. You wait for karma, you starve. But something strange began to unfold. Despite the court victory, the tourism project was canceled due to a shift in regional planning. His newly acquired land became flood-prone and dropped in value overnight. No one wanted it. Meanwhile, his house started leaking during storms. His workers left. His wife, once devoted, grew distant, whispering to her friends, "He's cold, heartless, obsessed with control." And then came the child. One rainy afternoon, as Thomas walked near the riverbank, he heard a faint cry from the bushes. He hesitated, pushed aside the leaves, and there, curled in the mud, was a child, no more than 3 years old. No clothes, shivering, alone. Thomas froze. Thunder cracked above, and in a moment he couldn't explain. He didn't think. He didn't analyze. He didn't calculate gain or loss. He simply took off his jacket, wrapped the child inside, and carried it home. From that day, everything changed. The child didn't speak, only watched him with large, curious eyes. No one claimed the boy, despite posters and police reports. Each morning, the child would follow Thomas around the house, clutching his pants, offering small gestures of affection. Each night, he slept curled at Thomas's feet. And then, one by one, more misfortunes arrived. A fire in his storage shed, crops dying unexpectedly, tenants canceling deals. His old business friends disappeared. Rumors swirled. That child is a curse, abandoned for a reason. Look at what's happening to him. Thomas said nothing. He couldn't sleep. Often he'd sit up all night, watching the child breathe, eyes wide open, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a deep ache. One night, a terrible fever struck him. Burning hot, drenched in sweat, he collapsed. No one came. He lay alone, unable to rise. But somehow, the child unlocked the door and wandered out into the storm, walking barefoot through mud and rain until he reached the home of a kind village healer. The child didn't speak. He only tugged at the healer's sleeve, pointing back toward the direction of the house. When Thomas awoke, the healer was boiling herbs beside the fire. The child lay curled beside him, soaking wet, trembling from cold. And Thomas cried, not from fear, not from anger, not from failure, but from something far more human. Sometimes, the things we fight hardest to avoid are the very things sent to awaken us. And perhaps, the moment we let go of control is when life truly begins to flow. Rain poured over the tin roof like 1,000 tiny drums. Thomas sat by the small fireplace, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping the bitter herbal tea the old village healer had left behind. His fever had broken, but the weariness in his bones remained. In the dim light, he looked over at the child, still asleep, curled in a blanket on the mat. His tiny frame shook slightly with each breath, damp hair clinging to his forehead. Thomas couldn't explain why, but each time he looked at this boy, something inside him stirred, a mix of guilt, fear, and something gentler, almost like love, though he wasn't ready to call it that. He had named the boy Noah. Noah didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just followed Thomas everywhere, like a shadow that asked for nothing, yet seemed to reflect everything Thomas had tried to bury for years. As days passed, Thomas began to feel the weight of change pressing on him. Where once he'd been consumed by the grind, expanding properties, sealing business deals, manipulating contracts, now he spent his mornings making kanji for a silent child and his afternoons mending leaking tiles. At first, he told himself it was temporary, just until he found the boy's parents. But inside, a quiet truth was blooming. He didn't want the child to leave. He remembered one morning waking up and not seeing Noah beside him. Panic surged in his chest. He rushed outside barefoot, calling his name. But Noah was simply in the backyard, squatting near a row of small plants, poking curiously at a caterpillar. Thomas had never felt more relieved or more foolish. One day, an old Buddhist monk visited the village for a Dharma talk. The villagers gathered at the temple, bringing offerings and questions. Thomas, carrying Noah on his hip, stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, unsure why he'd come. When the monk finished speaking, his eyes swept over the crowd and landed on Noah. He paused. Then he stepped down, walked slowly toward Thomas, and knelt before the child. His voice was calm but resonant. Child of silence, soul of karma. Thomas felt goosebumps on his arms. The monk turned to him and said, "Do you know where he comes from?" Thomas shook his head. "I found him by the river. He had no name. No one came to claim him." The monk looked down and gently placed a hand on the boy's head. 10 years ago, during the Great Flood, a couple from this village gave their lives to save others. They tied their infant son to a basket, set him afloat, and stayed behind, so others could climb into the last rescue boat. The crowd fell silent. The monk continued. This boy was found downriver, by strangers who raised him for a while, but as fate would have it, he was abandoned again. Some children carry the weight of past lives, karma heavy with sacrifice and sorrow, but they are not curses. They are blessings in disguise. Thomas stared at Noah, a child of sacrifice, a soul passed from pain to pain, and somehow, fate had brought him here. Later that night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat beside the child's bed, watching him breathe. All the wealth he had fought for, all the land he had stolen, all the victories that had turned hollow, none of them compared to the stillness he felt now. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something close. He whispered, "You're not my blood. You didn't choose me. But somehow, I feel like you've been sent to save me." Noah stirred, but didn't wake. His hand reached out and grasped Thomas's fingers. The following days were strange and beautiful. Thomas started changing. He walked past the lands he used to brag about and felt no pride. He visited his brother David's old hut, now abandoned, and placed a lotus flower on the doorstep. He began reading books the monk left behind, on impermanence, compassion, non-attachment. He stopped chasing control, stopped holding on to bitterness. And slowly, life responded. People in the village began speaking to him again. A few nodded respectfully as he passed. One woman even said, "He's different now, softer, like the river calmed him." And Noah, though still mute, began smiling more. His eyes sparkled when butterflies danced above the garden. He laughed soundlessly when the cat chased a feather. The house no longer felt heavy. It felt alive. Do you believe people can truly change? Or are some wounds too deep? Was it fate, karma, or coincidence that brought Noah into Thomas's life? What do you think? In our effort to control life, we often forget that life itself is flowing, like a river. But the river never asks to be held. It simply invites us to float. Thomas had tried to own everything: land, wealth, people's respect. But in the end, it was the small hand of a silent child that taught him what no courtroom, no contract, no victory ever could. The days grew quieter. Thomas and Noah settled into a life of simplicity. Morning walks along the riverside, a small garden to tend, evening meals of rice, vegetables, and laughter. Though Noah's laughter was silent, it lit the room like lanterns in the dark. But karma, as the Dharma teaches, is not always immediate. It is like seeds buried beneath the soil, waiting for the right season to bloom. And Thomas's season had come. It began with a knock on the door. Two men in suits, officials from the regional office. They handed Thomas a letter, cold, impersonal. The government had reviewed past property disputes and found inconsistencies. The court case from years ago, when he had seized his brother's land, was now under investigation. An anonymous tip, possibly from someone close. The land could be repossessed. Worse, there might be legal consequences. Thomas's hands trembled. The papers he once wielded like weapons now stared back at him as silent judgments. That evening, he sat by the river in silence, Noah beside him, tossing pebbles into the water. The wind was gentle, but Thomas's heart was heavy. "I thought I had buried the past," he whispered. "But karma remembers everything." He looked at Noah, who simply blinked, serene, as if telling him, "You already knew this day would come." A few days later, more came. A letter from the bank, his savings account frozen. His old lawyer, the same one who helped him cheat the system, had been arrested in a corruption probe. All clients under investigation. His name was on the list. That night, he lay awake staring at the wooden beams of his ceiling. Images rushed back, the trembling voice of his brother, the helplessness in David's eyes, the way Thomas had walked away without a second thought. He covered his face and wept. A visitor came the next morning. A man in his 30s, sharply dressed, standing confidently at the gate. Thomas recognized him instantly. Daniel, his only son. They hadn't spoken in 5 years, Not since Daniel left for the city, chasing wealth, ambition, and a life of comfort Thomas had once encouraged. "Dad," he said flatly, "I'm here for the inheritance." Thomas blinked. "What inheritance?" "The land, the house, whatever's left. I heard you're in trouble. Might as well transfer it to me now, before the government takes it." Thomas stared at him. This boy he'd raised, this mirror of who he used to be. Cold, calculating, proud. "I don't have much left," Thomas said. "But what I do have, I'm keeping for Noah." Daniel laughed, not out of amusement, but out of disgust. "For that mute street kid? You've gone senile." He turned, walked out without another word. Thomas didn't call after him. Instead, he turned to Noah, standing in the doorway, wide-eyed but calm. Thomas knelt, hugged him tightly. "You're not mine by blood, but you're my son in every way that matters." Days passed, then weeks. The land was officially taken by the state. The house remained, but with no title to it. Thomas knew one day he might lose that too. But something in him had shifted. He didn't fear loss anymore. He feared forgetting who he had become. On a rainy afternoon, he visited the temple. He found the old monk again, who smiled as Thomas bowed. "Master," he asked, "is this karma, all this pain?" The monk replied, "No, this is grace." Thomas frowned. "Grace? I lost everything." The monk placed a hand on his shoulder. "Karma is not punishment. It is the echo of your own actions. Grace is the chance to choose differently this time." That night, Thomas gathered all his old documents, land deeds, contracts, legal copies. He lit a fire in the garden and fed them one by one to the flames. Noah stood beside him, watching silently. "I don't want any of it," Thomas said. "I just want peace." Do you think karma is punishment, or a form of teaching? Should Thomas have given everything to his biological son, even after what Daniel said? The monsoon season returned. Rain fell like sheets of silver, cleansing the roofs, roads, and riversides. In Thomas's modest home, a warmth remained, not from firewood, but from quiet moments shared. He and Noah had formed a rhythm: silent breakfasts, gardening in the mud, reading old scriptures left by the monk, while Noah drew simple, beautiful pictures in the margins. Though the world around them seemed to fade, their bond grew stronger. But something in Noah had begun to change. Some mornings, he would wake from dreams in a cold sweat, breathing heavily, eyes filled with unspoken memories. Other times, he would sit by the window for hours, gazing at the river with a kind of haunted wisdom, far beyond his years. Thomas noticed, and he began to wonder, who really was this child? One morning, a traveling nun arrived in the village. Her robe soaked from the rain, she entered the temple and asked to see the abbot. She carried only a small satchel and a single faded photograph, one that would change everything. The monk invited Thomas to the temple the next day. When he arrived with Noah, the nun gasped softly. She stepped forward and dropped to her knees, tears flowing instantly. She clasped Noah's small hands in hers. "You're alive. Praise the bodhisattvas. You're alive." Noah tilted his head, confused, but calm. Thomas's heart pounded. The nun, her name was Sister Elira, began to speak. 10 years ago, I was one of the first to arrive at the flood zone, sent by our monastery to help with rescue efforts. It was chaos. Homes swept away, families crying, people clinging to rooftops. And then we saw them. A man and woman standing waist-deep in water, holding a baby in a bamboo basket. They had found the last boat, but instead of climbing in, they passed their child up to us. The mother whispered only 3 words: "Save our son." Then they let go. The waters swallowed them seconds later. Thomas stood frozen. Sister Elira pulled out the faded photograph, a young couple, wet and smiling, holding a baby wrapped in a cloth. It was old, the edges worn, but the resemblance was clear. It was Noah, his hair, his eyes, even the dimple in his cheek. Sister Elira continued, "We brought the baby to a shelter, but chaos reigned. Records were lost. Children were displaced. I searched for years. I never found him again. Until now." Thomas looked at Noah, who now sat quietly, eyes on the photo, as if recognizing something his heart never forgot. That night, Thomas sat alone on the steps of the temple. Rain tapped softly on the stone tiles. The monk approached and sat beside him. "He is the son of sacrifice," Thomas said. "He is also your teacher," the monk replied. Thomas turned, surprised. "He showed you the Dharma without words. He softened your anger without arguments. He reminded you what love is, without saying a single thing." Thomas's throat tightened. "I thought I was saving him," he whispered. "No," the monk said gently. "He was sent to save you." Days passed, then weeks. Noah began speaking, not in full sentences, but words here and there. His first word was Bodhi, pointing to a tree in the temple yard. Thomas wept. As the story of Noah's past spread through the village, people came to see the boy, not out of pity, but reverence. They brought offerings to the temple. Some asked for blessings. Others came just to sit near him. They called him the silent child of grace. One night, as Thomas tucked Noah into bed, the boy whispered, "Am I a curse?" Thomas knelt beside him, heart aching. "No," he said firmly. "You are a gift. A blessing that came wrapped in pain, yes. But the greatest truths in life, they always come that way." Noah reached out, touching Thomas's chest. "Then, you're my father?" Thomas closed his eyes, tears falling. "If you'll have me, I always have been." Can a child carry the karma of their parents? Or do they carry something deeper, like destiny? Is love defined by blood, or by the heart that chooses to stay? Let us know in the comments. Your perspective could heal someone. The morning air was thick with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that arrives before something must be done, when the heart knows there's no more running, no more pretending. Thomas stood at the edge of his land, the same plot he had once fought, lied, and manipulated to acquire. The land that tore a family apart. The land that cost him his brother's trust. Now it was overgrown, cracked, almost forgotten. And yet, the weight of it still lingered in his chest. "It's time," he whispered. He returned home and opened an old wooden box beneath his bed. Inside, legal papers, land deeds, court files, every document that tied him to the past he no longer wanted to be part of. His fingers trembled as he picked up the first sheet. The ink had faded, but the pain it represented was fresh. Noah stood behind him, silent. "These were once my pride," Thomas said. "Now, they feel like chains." They walked together to the riverbank, just as the sun began to rise. A small clay pot held burning coals. One by one, Thomas fed the papers into the fire. Land deed. Burned. Court ruling. Burned. A letter from his former lawyer. Burned. Ashes drifted upward like black petals on the morning breeze. Noah asked softly, "Does it still hurt?" Thomas looked at him and smiled through wet eyes. "Yes, but I think pain is how the heart says goodbye." Later that day, Thomas made his way to the abandoned hut where his brother David used to live. The roof had partially collapsed. Ivy crawled across the walls, but the air, it still held the scent of old incense and the sound of memories. He knelt down before the entrance and bowed deeply. "Brother," he whispered, "I was wrong. I knew it then, but I didn't have the courage to admit it." He pulled from his pocket a small wooden box. Inside was the key to a storage chest back in his house, one that held the only money he had left, the last of his savings. He placed it gently on the doorstep. "You may not be here to receive it," he said, "but I offer it nonetheless. May it find someone in need, and may your soul find peace." The wind picked up, lifting dry leaves into the sky like prayers. That evening, he returned to the temple. The old monk met him at the gate, sensing what had happened. "You let go," the monk said. Thomas nodded. "And it broke me." The monk smiled gently. "No, it opened you." The following weeks brought a different kind of stillness into Thomas's life. Not the emptiness of loss, but the calm of acceptance. He no longer tried to fix the future or relive the past. He simply woke, cooked, cleaned, tended the garden, and sat in silence beside Noah under the Bodhi tree. Sometimes Noah would rest his head on Thomas's lap. Other times they would chant together, soft, imperfect, but sincere. One day, as they swept the temple courtyard, a young traveler passed by. She watched them work, then approached Thomas. "You're the one they call the man who gave up everything?" He looked up, surprised. "I suppose that's true," he said. She smiled. "Then maybe you're the one I was meant to meet." She stayed for weeks, helping around the temple. Eventually, others came. A man grieving the loss of his wife, a girl recovering from addiction, a family searching for peace. One by one, people drawn by stories, not of miracles, but of surrender, began to fill the once empty spaces. Thomas didn't preach. He didn't teach. He simply lived. And that was enough. Have you ever had to let go of something, even when it hurt? What happened next? Do you believe forgiveness is still possible if the other person is no longer alive? The river had always been there. Through storms and seasons, drought and flood, it never stopped flowing. As a child, Thomas once feared it. As a young man, he saw it as a boundary to conquer. But now, as an old man with calloused hands and a quiet heart, he saw the river differently. It had never been his enemy. It had always been his teacher. One morning, Thomas stood barefoot at the riverbank, holding a simple wooden lantern in his hands. Inside it was a single flame, small but steady. Noah stood beside him, now 10 years old, taller, calmer, eyes like still water. "What's it for?" the boy asked softly. "It's for everything I held on to," Thomas replied, "and everything I need to let go." Inside the lantern was a strip of paper. On it, Thomas had written just 5 words: control, pride, guilt, fear, attachment. He had thought of writing a long letter. He had even considered burning old photos, items from his past, but in the end, he realized the only weight he truly carried was within. The monk had once said, "What you release into the river is not for the river to carry, but for you to stop carrying." So Thomas whispered a prayer and placed the lantern on the water. The current caught it gently. The flame flickered, but did not die. It floated downstream, glowing like a single star drifting through the darkness. Noah reached for Thomas's hand. They stood together in silence. That evening, Thomas sat beneath the Bodhi tree, watching dusk turn the sky to gold. Noah lay beside him, his head resting on Thomas's shoulder. "Are you sad?" the boy asked. "No," Thomas replied. "Not sad, just empty." "Empty is bad?" "No, empty means there's room now for peace." Later, a group of villagers arrived quietly at the temple. They brought food, flowers, and quiet prayers. They asked if Thomas would speak at the full moon gathering, just to share his story. He hesitated. He was no teacher, no monk, just a man who had made mistakes, lost everything, and found something better. But the monk smiled and said, "That's the only kind of teacher the world ever really needs." That night, under the full moon, Thomas spoke for the first time. "I used to think letting go meant weakness, that surrender meant failure, that loss meant the end. But the truth is, letting go is the only way we stop drowning." He paused. "The river doesn't ask us to fight it. It only asks us to trust it." A tear slid down his cheek, but not from pain. It was gratitude. When the gathering ended, Thomas walked alone to the river once more. He sat by its edge, feeling the soil beneath his fingers. The moonlight shimmered on the surface. "Let go," he whispered. "Let it flow." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt light. Years passed. Time, like the river, never stopped. It simply changed form. Thomas had grown older, his hair white, his hands slower, but his heart lighter than ever. He no longer chased, no longer resisted. He simply was. Every morning he swept the temple yard, offered rice to the birds, and sat beneath the Bodhi tree in silence. And Noah, once the quiet boy with heavy eyes, had become a young man of serene presence. At only 16, he was already known in nearby villages as the Gentle One. People came not because he spoke wise words, he still spoke little, but because his silence healed. One day, during the annual Dharma celebration, the monk approached Thomas. "It's time," he said. Thomas knew what he meant. He had felt it coming. Noah would begin his path as a novice monk. It felt both like a loss and a fulfillment. The boy he once found in the rain was now becoming someone the world needed. That night, Thomas sat with Noah beneath the stars. "Are you afraid?" he asked. Noah shook his head. "You?" Thomas smiled. "No, I just wish I had more time." Noah took his hand. "You gave me all the time I needed." The next morning, the ceremony was held. Villagers gathered. Flowers lined the temple steps. The old monk shaved Noah's head gently, while Thomas stood watching, eyes filled with pride and tenderness. As the final strands of hair fell, so too did the last remnants of the past. The boy was now a monk. The silence had become sacred. The pain had become purpose. A few weeks later, Thomas grew ill. Not suddenly, not violently, just a quiet weakening, like a candle slowly burning lower. He knew. One afternoon, he asked for help to be taken to the riverbank. Noah came with him, robes flowing gently in the breeze. They sat together, side by side, just as they had done years before when the first lantern floated downstream. "Noah," Thomas said weakly, "I want you to remember something. Yes, you were never my burden. You were my awakening. Tears welled in Noah's eyes. And you, he whispered, were my beginning. As the sun began to set, Thomas closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. The monk approached, placed his hand on Thomas's chest, and softly chanted a prayer. May you be free from suffering. May you cross the river of illusion. May your heart rest in the eternal Dharma. That night, the entire village lit lanterns and released them into the river, hundreds of flames floating side by side, weaving a path of light across the water, a silent tribute to a man who had once tried to own the world and ended up liberating himself from it. Noah stood at the river's edge, hands in prayer, and whispered a final chant. In letting go, he flowed home. What is one thing you've held on to that you're finally ready to let go? Does enlightenment come from knowing more or needing less?